The AI that you're using today will be the worst AI that you ever use. This is a phrase that I see thrown around quite a bit in the current environment of generative AI adoption and understanding. And while I think it's useful and true in many situations, it may not always be true. So I'm going to examine why that will be the case in some scenarios going forward. So, welcome to the Talk to Me PDD podcast. I'm your host, PDD. This is a podcast where we talk all things knowledge work, tech, management, leadership, and as often as not lately, artificial intelligence, which we'll be talking about today. This is episode 37, and we're going to talk about monetizing generative AI chatbots in the consumer space. If you like this content, if you like this podcast, please like and subscribe, share with your friends. If you have content or feedback for me, hit me up on LinkedIn or in the comments. Love to hear from everybody. So, this concept of technology always getting better, things getting better for end users, falls under the idea of techno-determinism, that over the long run, technology is going to improve, it's going to naturally lead to progress that cascades down to all of us. And I think this idea of, today's AI models are the worst AI models that we'll ever interact with as users falls under this umbrella. And that may not always be the case, even if the models get better. So we're going to take a look at why that might be. I wrote a number of articles about this. I'll link to them. I'm not going to go through every detail here. I'm going to try and summarize things so you get the high level idea. But if you want to drill down more, I'll put the links in the show notes and you can read more about it. So one of the things to think about is, what are these companies that are building consumer facing generative AI chatbots about? They're all for profit companies, and eventually they are going to want to turn a profit on their investments. And right now, they're not in the chat space for generative AI based chats. So eventually, that's going to happen. I think we'll see a push for it sooner rather than later, at least in some cases, because of the just huge costs to build out generative AI infrastructure, to train large language models. All of these companies are spending billions and billions of dollars to do this and not making that money back yet. But even if that weren't the case, ultimately these are for-profit companies and they need to grow to appease shareholders, to be able to make money to fund future investments, and just to operate as a for-profit business. So even without the cost pressures that may be there today on supporting the infrastructure and the training, eventually these companies would likely turn to profit generating in general. So what can we compare generative AI chatbots to, and maybe look for some examples of how this has happened in other tech industries? I think the most obvious one is web search. Many use cases for generative AI chatbots are effectively replacing search or some other form of information retrieval. There have been some studies showing how people are using that. I know there's a variety of different uses, but a significant one is web search. And I think it's really interesting because different experts have wildly different opinions on this. People that I respect on both ends of kind of the spectrum of how they look at web search. Some people will say, using generative AI chatbots for search is the only valid or useful thing that they can do, where others are saying, this is a complete waste of these resources and you shouldn't use it. So be that as it may, that's a significant volume of what users are using these consumer facing chatbots for. So I think it's useful to compare to web search. So if you were around sort of in the early days of internet search and you remember when Google first came on the scene, it was so much better than any other search engine. And some of the hallmarks that really stood out were it had a very minimal and simple interface, and it got you really useful information. And I think if you look at a lot of how these chatbots are set up today, it's pretty similar. They're pretty minimal. They do a pretty good job of organizing information, taking out some of the clutter and some of the noise that's snuck into web search these days and to websites in general. So pretty similar in the early days, and I think that appeals to a lot of users. Also, as we think about techno-determinism and technology automatically getting better for the end user, Web search and Google in particular is a great example to look at. It sort of surprises me that I don't see more people talking about this, but there's a great article by Ed Zitron called The Man Who Killed Google Search. And it's based on documentation that came out when Google was investigated for antitrust. And this is all now in the public domain. But it's clear that they made a conscious decision to make their technology, their web search, worse, so that users would have to look through more results and see more ads so they can continue growing ad revenue. So I think that's a pretty good example that tech is not always going to improve the experience for end users. In that case, it took an experience and made it worse in order for the company to make more money. So that's always something that I think is good to bear in mind as we think about how tech in general and specifically with generative AI chatbots may evolve. Um, those companies may take the technology and the technology experience in a direction that is not necessarily beneficial for end users. Um, so web search is heavily funded and extremely profitable because of the ad markets that these companies operate. Being able to show you contextual ads with your search, to have a platform for advertisers to go in and sort of drill down on various segments, knowing user data, information about the search. So all that sort of thing is going to be available for generative AI chatbots. And I think they even have a richer set of data and much more personal data. Think about the types of conversations that users are having with chatbots and just the level of detail and information that's shared. You have a much more rich data set that you can use for targeting advertisements if these companies want to do that. You also have the option of using generative AI to build your ads. So as opposed to having even highly targeted static ads, you can have highly targeted ads that are personalized to the user or to aspects about the user, that may be even more persuasive or successful in converting. Um, One of the sort of maybe more far-fetched ideas, but maybe not, that I put out in sort of the piece about advertising is you could potentially have large companies that choose to sponsor model development. Building these models is increasingly more and more costly. You think about how much a large company spends on a Super Bowl advertisement, for example. Spending a comparable amount or more to have a model look favorably on your business could be money well spent for those advertisers. And I think it could be done in a way that the model development companies could build the same model and have one that they branch for business and commercial use that doesn't have any of that advertisement, and then a consumer one that does. So essentially doing this in post training after you've gone through the heavy effort of pre training. So they'd sort of be able to have their cake and eat it too, being able to build commercial models that had the cost offset a bit from the advertising, and then to have an advertising infused model that goes out to consumers. We'll see if that happens. That's certainly a step further than some of these other things, but a possibility. Um, Now, one of the modalities that I think is really interesting and persuasive for the GPT chatbots is being able to interact in voice. And there's already lots of data and studies showing that the chat portion is incredibly persuasive when Gen AI is talking to people. I think you layer voice and some personalization on top of that, becomes even more persuasive, which is a good selling point for an advertising platform where you're trying to persuade users. That voice modality often comes into play in a mobile use case. So again, that gives even more data to advertisers targeting based on your location. Maybe if you're in the car, traveling somewhere, if you're on a bike, by your rate of speed, being able to kind of guess and do even more targeted advertising there, I think can be really useful. We think about sort of voice interactions, whether it's on like a Zoom or a Teams call, or even chatting on your phone or using a voice interface, as wanting to filter out sort of the noise in the environment so you can be clear what the user is saying. And while chatbots would want to do that to sort of get the text input, you can also listen to what's happening in the environment. And you think about that in an advertising framework. If I'm in a car and you hear my kids in the background and they're talking about they're hungry or something like that, that's pretty valuable for advertisers who know where I am, know where I'm traveling, and could give me really targeted advertisements. So another opportunity there. So we'll see what happens. Um, I really think the killer app for kind of connecting advertising and more powerful things on these platforms is going to be the implementation of agents that can go out and buy things, make purchases on your behalf. Agents are all about being able to take action. They don't necessarily have to be generative AI in and of themselves. You think if you had an agent that was going to order you something from a restaurant, it's pretty deterministic. There's only so many things that it can order. There's only so many actions that it can take. So while you might want to interact in a natural language interface, and once you sort of get into the decisions that can happen, it's a pretty constrained environment. So I can see agents sort of taking the role that apps play on our phone today, but now having your chat interface as an orchestrator to do all of that. And you're not limited by some things like you have in the Apple Store where there are constraints about apps talking to each other. Now, there's certainly security and privacy trade offs and things like that that you would have to consider. But if you now have a chatbot environment you can talk to on voice, it has a bunch of agents for restaurants that you go to or may want to purchase from, or even stores or other things, and you can interact with it. They can give you ads, they can give you offers based on where you are and other targeted information. And then you can purchase directly on that platform. That's a good way to make money, I think, for these platforms. And I think in some situations it can really be good and helpful for users. It's going to be a balance, though, about what's actually beneficial for people and what's beneficial for the platforms and advertisers. Um, Last but not least, kind of wrapping up with some other just miscellaneous topics about these platforms. The models are good enough today. There's going to be continued innovation there and continued competition. But all of the things that I've written about and talked about in these articles, you can do today with models that we have today, even the less powerful ones. So while that's generally important, I don't know how much it matters for some of these scenarios, and where a lot of it's turning to using a model to understand natural language, and then some sort of web search to bring in additional relevant content that's not necessarily in the model, and put it all together, or being able to interact with agents, which are going to be maintained separately. So I think the models become more of a commodity piece of this whole puzzle, than a differentiator in and of themselves. It's a bit of a winner take all fight for models. You can see when somebody comes out with a new one that is exciting or does something else, users can just go to that. There's not really any stickiness on these platforms. And I think that's one of the main problems for um, creating continuous profit and tying users in, is that there's really pretty easy to leave. There's not the same type of friction as if you're on a social media network and you've sort of built up a presence there and connections and you can't take that with you. There really isn't any of that on these chat environments. I think with some personalization, um, and how people get attached to their AI companion and tuning that to you, that can do some of that. And I think that will help and persuade some users to stay, but it's still not the same type of stickiness to stay on the platform that you see in social media. So that'll be interesting. I haven't really thought of other ways that the platform providers can sort of lock users in, which I think is good for them if you can lock users in. I think the fact that they can't is good for competition. It's probably good for end users. Some of these more extreme advertising or data harvesting concepts that I talked about, I think those will be held in check as long as there's competition. There's lots of players in the field right now. And if you as a provider go into advertising or one of the more extreme versions here and your competitors don't, there's not a whole lot that's holding your users to your platform. So I think providers will have to be careful while there's competition and lots of players. Now, that may change. Some companies may go out of business, some may consolidate, Some may try and just focus on their core businesses and move their AI work into that as opposed to more general consumer facing chatbots. So if there's some consolidation there, then there's opportunity for collusion and sort of monopolizing the market like has happened in search. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there. Um, and then lastly, there are all sorts of other concerns as we go down this road of advertising and data harvesting, obviously user privacy, various adversarial types of uses of the platform. Um, could be things like if you can get really targeted, potentially stalking someone through an ad, even with privacy preserving data techniques, if you can get specific enough, could target a specific user potentially. Um, Trying to influence fraud schemes or insert security vulnerabilities for people that are trying to do technical work. Even political influence, right? If you start merging in generative content or making it not so obvious where model generation ends and advertising starts, you put political ads in and use that to influence certain people. So, all sorts of potential harms that we have to be careful of, as always, with AI and machine learning type systems. So, I think it'll be interesting to see. I think these companies absolutely need to and want to turn a profit, but the fact that there really isn't that stickiness on the platform yet, and I'm not quite sure how they're going to get there, and there's competition, I think we'll hold it in check for some time. So keep an eye on it and we'll see what happens. And I hope you found this interesting. Check out the articles. I'll put them in the show notes, and take care.